So, for the next part of this lecture, we are going to be looking at the process of change in Poland and Hungary. So now, the process of change, it's been argued that it began in Poland and Hungary. So in Poland, it's been said that there had been a huge upsurge of social confrontation in 1980 to 1981, which paralyzed the activity of the state for more than a year and a quarter. So in 1947, Poland became a communist people's republic after Soviet-run elections. In 1957, more than 50 people were killed rioting in Poznan over demands for greater freedom. And then in 1970, there's a food price riot in Gdansk. The protests were then suppressed and hundreds are killed. In 1980, disturbances at the shipyard in Gdansk led to the formation of the Solidarity Trade Union, which we mentioned in our first part, under Lech Walesa. So in 1981, martial law was imposed. Many of the Solidarity leaders, including Walesa, are imprisoned. But the military coup of December 1981 broke the back of the independent union Solidarity, which is also called Solidarnosc, even if it could not destroy the influence of underground opposition to the regime. And then in the summer and spring of 1988, two waves of strikes occurred. These surprised both the regime and most of the old Solidarnosc leadership. During the first wave, there was quite a strong feeling among the intellectual advisors of Solidarnosc that the strikes were a mistake. There was not much more enthusiasm for the second wave, although Solidarnosc best known national leader Lech Walesa had realized that his political standing required that he be part of the occupation of the linen shipyard in Gdansk. So the attitude of Solidarity leadership meant that the strikes were restricted to four major centers and did not generalize to anything like the same degrees as in 1980, 1981. So the strikes were certainly not on such a scale as to break the power of the ruling class and revolutionize society. What they did do, however, was to create a bitter debate within the ruling layers of Polish society on how they should safeguard their own future. And in the end, they adopted the strategy suggested by the Interior Minister, Kizak. So they agreed to round table discussions with the opposition and with independents in return for the national leadership of Solidarnosc, telling workers not to strike. So out of the round table came an agreement on semi-free elections, and out of these acceptance by the leaders of the old ruling party that a Solidarnosc advisor should be prime minister in the government, committed to restructuring through agreement with the IMF, the command economy, and wide-scale privatization. So the same people as before remained in charge of the enterprises, the police and the armed forces. The media were purged of those who had thrown their weight behind the previous period of military rule, and journalists who had been sacked for supporting Solidarnosc were reinstated, but there were few other personnel changes in the press and television. Judges were simply told to be partially neutral from now on. Meanwhile, managers who had risen to their positions as part of the old what they call nomenclatura, which is a list of individuals drawn up by the Communist Party from which were selected candidates for a vacant senior position in the state, party, and other important organizations. So now they use their influence and wealth to buy up sections of industry, and an estimated 15,000 cooperatives were set up by members of the nomenclatura. It is it is difficult to see in this sequence of events anything that could, however, remotely be called, a revolution or counter-revolution. So let's first look at the 1983 martial law. Ne? So the martial law was lifted in 1983 in Poland, but they still had curfews, rationing, censorship, food and housing shortages, and rising of prices. So what we see before us is a political cartoon by someone called Etta Halmer. This cartoon appeared in the what's it called? The Fort Worth Star Telegram. We can see, as you can see, there's a woman and a man. They are talking and they are wearing winter clothes. The man says martial law has been lifted here in Poland, but we still have curfews, rationing, censorship, food and housing shortages, and rising prices. He also says, and stand in line long enough will be rewarded with a rain check for an extra slice of bread. So what is the difference? And then the woman replies and she says, well, I heard a rumor that if we demonstrate enough political reliability, plus an official Christmas greeting telling us that it's the thought that counts. Okay, so in 1983, the Polish authorities announced an end to the 19 months of martial law from midnight and declared a limited amnesty for political prisoners. The announcement by head of state Henryk Jablonski to a packed parliament closed a unique chapter in the history of communist East Europe, which began with the creation of the Solidarity Free Trade Union in 1980. The Prime Minister and Communist Party leader, General Wojciech, who is in the above front in a parliament speech, rejected any suggestions that the present moves might have been taken in response to Western sections. So the end of the martial law comes in effect on the National Day. And then in 1989, roundtable talks between Solidarity, the Communist, and the Catholic Church. There's that, and then partially free elections see widespread success of Solidarity, which helps to form a coalition government. Then in 1990, Walesa was elected president of Poland. Market reforms are launched. There's large-scale privatization. In 1992, Soviet troops begin to leave Poland. In 1993, reformed communists enter the coalition government. They promised to continue the market reforms. And then just a side note, in 1997, the Polish parliament adopted a new constitution and the general election is won by Solidarity Group. So now let's look at the significance of solidarity. So solidarity radically changed Poland, uniting the people and challenging the communist government. So Solidarity leader Walesa went on to become the first non-communist president of Poland after Soviet invasion. So Poland is often referred to as the first domino in the fall of the Soviet Empire. The reform movement that ended communism in East Central Europe, culminating with the fall of the Berlin Wall, began in Poland. If not for solidarity, it could have taken years longer for resistance in Eastern Europe to challenge communist rule. Now, looking at Hungary. So, in Hungary, where the political changes have gone at least as far as in Poland, there's been so far even less social confrontation. The organized opposition in Hungary was until as late as 1987 very small. In attempts to build support inside the working class in the early 1980s, the attempts were half-hearted and unsuccessful. Its first demonstrations in 1987 and 1988 were no more than a few thousand strong and composed mainly of students. So the opening towards democracy came not because of the pressure from below, but because of growing international indebtedness and fears of economic crisis created splits, among the top party leaders. So a handful of these conspired at the party congress in the spring of 1988 to oust the old party leader Janos Kadar. They believed it was necessary to push economic reform even further towards a completely market system. So what we see is they all endorsed what they openly referred to as Thatcherite policies. They also agreed that they needed to open up the political structures if they were to get the support they needed to carry out these measures. But then, as in Poland, bitter rows had broken out among the new which ruling group about which political direction to follow. So one section around someone called Imre Pozsgay, who was a Hungarian communist politician who played a key role in Hungary's transition to democracy. So they sought to strengthen its hand by collaboration with sections of the opposition. So, in the new political climate, people who had refused to join the opposition groups in the past, either out of fear or because they craved the social advance open to supporters of the ruling party, they suddenly rushed to join in. So, the opposition political demonstrations were suddenly hundreds of thousands strong. Even government ministers joined, a dozen new parties were formed, and the ruling party candidates were defeated in a series of by-elections. Then the party itself formally split into two. So the changes in Hungary were the catalyst for change in East Germany. The Hungarian government, weak and looking to the opposition for support, did not feel in any condition to prevent East Germans who had entered the country in the guise of tourists crossing over into the West. Fast Germany began to experience a hemorrhaging of skilled labor for the first time since the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. So the sudden weakness of East German government gave new heart to the previously very small and easily repressed oppositional groups in the country. They staged their first demonstrations, some thousands strong, in Dresden early in October, and they were chanting, "We're staying here, Gorby, Gorby." So the violence of police attacks on the protest drew thousands more onto the streets in a dozen cities in the days that followed. So what we see then is suddenly the leadership of the ruling party, they become isolated and they are desperate. So one grouping around the aging party leader, Honecker, began preparations to shoot the demonstrators. Other sections of the leadership regarded this option as very dangerous. So they could not rely for support on Gorbachev, who had every reason to dislike a regime which was openly critical of his policies, and mass repression would completely mess up relations with West Germany, on which the regime was increasingly dependent on economically. So the head of security, who was called Egon Krenz, staged coup, which ousted Honecker and then tried to pacify the demonstrators by promising reform. So suddenly the opposition group were operating legally, and middle ranking party officials were joining their demonstrations in an effort to gain control of them. But the immediate effect was simply to give vast numbers of people the feeling that for the first time it was safe to protest. So the ruling party could only keep a semblance of control by making more and more concessions, promising freedom to travel, guaranteeing free elections, sacrificing growing numbers of the old leaders, and arresting most openly the ones who are openly corrupt, arresting them, and eventually beginning to dismantle the Berlin Wall. So Krenz, the ouster of Honecker, was himself ousted by Modrow as the party leader began its own roundtable meetings with the opposition groups and its own former front parties, which themselves took an increasingly independent stance. So now looking at dynamics of change in Czechoslovakia. So it was very similar to that of East Germany. It was inspired by events elsewhere. Students decided to stage a demonstration on the 17th of November. There had been previous protest marches, for instance, on the 20th of October to mark the anniversary of the Russian invasion in 1969. But earlier police clampdowns had kept these relatively small. So Western journalists actually, this is interesting, noted that most passerbys kept well away from these protests. So this time there was, however, a legal pretext for the demonstrations. The ruling party's youth organization had decided to commemorate the date of a student protests at the Nazi takeovers of the country 50 years before. So the demonstrations were bigger than either the government or the opposition had expected. The government sent in a previously unknown force of anti-terrorist troops to attack and beat up the protesters. So now the attack is referred to in Prague as the 17th November massacre. In fact, no one died, and the police attack was not so different to those made by the forces of law and order in Western states. For instance, on workers in Britain picketing in Warrington, Orgrave, and Wapping. So the sight of protesters, usually still in their late teens, suffering such an onslaught was enough to galvanize into action a wider number of people. So students right across Czechoslovakia began to protest, to strike. A decision by drama students to join this prompted actors, directors, and theater technicians to join in. Suddenly, every Prague theater was turned into a center of discussion and oppositional activity, and hundreds and thousands of people joined in demonstrations. So, spontaneous teams of agitators went out to every workplace and every town and village in the country to explain what was happening in central Prague. The oppositional group, which was called Civic Forum, was suddenly a mass movement which showed its strength on the 27th of November by organizing a highly successful 2-hour strike across the country. So now, what I'm about to do, I am about to take you guys through um, Prague with a series of photos from a gallery. So in 1989, just 8 days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a student protest against communist rule was violently put down in Prague, the Czechoslovakia capital. So the crackdown on November 17 only strengthened the protest movement And within days, hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets. And by the end of the month, the Communist Party agreed to hold free elections. Or in December 1989, um, someone called Václav Havel was elected president of the country's federal assembly, and this marking the beginning of a new democratic era. So, as we can see here in the picture, in January 1989, protesters were already mustering their courage. In this photo, we can see police violently detained demonstrators, marking the 20th anniversary of the self-immolation of student Jan Palach. So his suicide was an act of protest against the 1968 Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. And then we see here in this photo the police race after protesters who had gathered to mark the anniversary of the 1968 Soviet-led invasion of August 21. The first cracks were appearing in communist rule. We have here demonstrators on Prague's Wenceslas Square flash victory signs as they demand freedom and victory on October 28, 1989, the anniversary of the founding of Czechoslovakia in 1918. So now we see here that the turning point came on November 17, 1989, then observed as International Students' Day, and the commemoration of Nazi forces killing of students 50 years earlier. So in the largest protest in 20 years, thousands of students marched peacefully through the city center until they were stopped at Narodny National Street by a cordon of riot police. Students here, we see they light candles near a police cordon. Although the protests were non-violent and students chanted, "We have bare hands," to tell authorities that they were unarmed, riot police sealed off escape routes and still attacked them. Hundreds were injured in the crackdown. In this photo, we see a woman offers flowers to the riot police who had stopped demonstrators on Prague's Narodny Street. We see here in this image that riot police block a bridge to prevent protesters marching to Prague Castle, the seat of the Czechoslovak president, on November 19. The demonstrators were growing rapidly. They were fueled by the shock at the authorities, the brutality they had used on the first night. And we see here protesters are kneeling as they faced riot police on the 19th of November. The authorities again responded with police brutality. On this picture, there's a man carrying his son and a Czechoslovak flag faces riot police on November 19 alongside hundreds of other protesters. Here we have protest wave Czechoslovak flags in front of the National Film School as students and theater actors declared a strike. And then on November 21st, the fifth consecutive day of protest, the crowds had swelled to some 200,000 people on Prague's Wenceslas Square. It's a lot of people. And then people light candles in front of a line of riot police who had stopped protesters from crossing a bridge on November 21. We see here Havel, who was a dissident playwright and former political prisoner. He's addressing protesters from a balcony overlooking Wenceslas Square on November 24. The crowd had grown to some 300,000 people. Now, the protest had to relocate to a space large enough to accommodate this large number of people. 500,000 people came to listen to speeches from Havel and other opposition leaders in Letna Park on October 26. Amazing, eh? So here we see a bust of former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin with the caption reading, "Nothing lasts forever." This is seen in the Prague Wenceslas Square on the first day of a general strike, November 27. Here we see leaders of the Obkhanske Forum, which is the civic forum, opposition group, meet at their ad hoc headquarters in a Prague theater. Havel is seated second from the right. So at a protest on Wenceslas Square on December 19th, a banner reads Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle, which is a popular slogan in support of Havel becoming president. Huge crowds continued to gather after the communists backed down and agreed to free elections. We see here Havel and his wife Olga greeting citizens at Prague Castle after Havel was appointed president of Czechoslovakia by the Federal Assembly on December 29. And then we see here on the last image on December 31, people celebrate the beginning of a new year, a new government, and a new democratic era. So in one sense, there was a sharp contrast between events in Czechoslovakia and those in Poland and Hungary. Here, there were many of the elements of a real revolution. The masses took to the streets and forced concessions from the old order. There was continual agitation on the streets. The center of Prague, with its occupied colleges and theaters, resembled nothing so much as Paris in May 1968. The civic forum committees and strike committees sprang up in the workplaces and the media as well as in the localities. The Veterans Chair's Marxist oppositionist Vladimir Riha, when asked who organized the movement, he could only reply, "No one. Everyone did what they wanted to do, but it was not anarchy, it was a revolution." So, in conclusion, once the people in these countries got a taste of freedom, many of them did not want to remain citizens under communist governments anymore. Now that they could speak out, because remember, they were repressed. Now that they could speak out, citizens demanded independence. By the late 80s, a communist government began to fall, and many Eastern European countries replaced their old communist regimes with more democratic forms of government and allowed more capitalism. Eventually, the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 90s. It broke into several independent countries, and the collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War and Western fears about communism in Europe. Thank you so much for attending the lecture. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.